We definitely have two name brands in college football, but a bit of an unexpected national championship with Oregon taking on Ohio State next Monday, January 12th. We're joined by Matt Brown of SB Nation to break down the Buckeyes and the Ducks. Matt, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us. I think before we match up these two teams that like to push it down the field and score a ton of points, let's run down some key injuries for the Buckeyes. Dontre Wilson, of course, a speed guy out of the backfield that they like to move around, has been out of commission for quite some time, and Jeff Hireman, also a guy that at tight end doesn't catch a ton of passes, isn't going to wow anyone with statistics, but is an integral part of that Ohio State run game and pass game.
Yeah, Hireman's somebody who really came in with very high expectations this season, but has really struggled to be healthy. I think the Buckeyes were definitely thinking that they were going to be getting a little bit more superlative statistical performances out of him this season. But at the beginning of the year, he was struggling with being hurt. He said before during the last press conference that they'd have to kill him for him not to play. So I'm sure he's going to be out there, but I wouldn't be expecting a 100-yard performance out of him. For Wilson, the interesting thing here may be what happens with the punt return game, which has been currently manned by Jalen Marshall, somebody with exceptional athleticism, really contributed at multiple positions here for Ohio State, but has struggled with the punt game. Has struggled with turning the ball over, with his decision-making and where to catch the ball, where to do fair catches. It's been kind of an adventure for Ohio State fans who are used to really exceptional special teams. If Wilson's healthy enough to play, would not shock me to see him contributing primarily at that side of the field.
You know, Matt, I was going to start with the offense and the defense, but now that you go to special teams really quickly there, Sean Nurenberger hasn't necessarily been automatic this season. Of course, this game could come down to field goals and maybe one in the clutch. Do you think the confidence factor is with Mr. Nurenberger at this point?
That's probably not the section where Ohio State fans are most confident with their kicking game, but I don't think people will, and certainly we don't here at Land-Grant, view him necessarily as a liability. Ohio State's been fortunate this year that they haven't really had to win a game on the strength of their kicker, and I imagine that this game it's likely to have lots of touchdowns, lots of possessions. It would surprise me a little bit if it came down to 2 or 3 points, but if Ohio State's able to get that inside the 40, Nurenberger's somebody who's consistent enough that I don't think this is going to hinge on a really badly missed kick.
And fortunately for Buckeye fans, we got to see a bit of a test against Alabama, not in a game-winning type situation, but just knowing points were at a premium, being an underdog, and he knocked home a few early in the football game. Let's talk offense and defense. The question I get, Matt, all the time, and it seems to be the first one that rolls out of people's mouths automatically is, can Ohio State hang with Oregon? It doesn't seem to ever get flipped. It's just typically, can the Buckeyes hang with Oregon on offense? We saw an offense in the Rose Bowl that ran a play every 20 seconds. So what do you think the Buckeyes do to try to possibly match that in practice and get up to that tempo defensively?
Well, I definitely think Ohio State can hang with Oregon as far as offense is concerned. I don't think this is an offense that can really be stopped per se, not just the tempo, but given Oregon's ability to attack the field horizontally and the fact that this is probably the deepest team that Oregon has had over the last several years. Maybe not necessarily the best in certain position groups, but in terms of athleticism and depth all over the field, this is probably their best squad. The one advantage that I think Ohio State's defense has is they get to face the Ohio State offense in practice. And this is a team that also likes to push the tempo, that also has exceptional speed, and that runs some similar sets to Oregon. So it's not like Ohio State's secondary or Ohio State's defensive line is going to be coming in here completely blind. If you look at advanced statistics, if you look at the F+ and S&P, Oregon and Ohio State's offenses are peers to each other. I think they're both in the top 5. So I would imagine that this game is going to feature plenty of points, and both sides are capable of scoring well enough to stay in the game.
My concern going into the playoff game against Alabama was twofold. It was Cardell Jones, obviously, despite the rocket arm and the huge frame and size to run the football when needed. And despite the success against Wisconsin, there was no game situation adversity.
Sure.
They rolled from the first play of the game. And secondly, maybe no adversity when it came to a pass rush or complex coverages. He clearly passed the test. He had some rough spots, but any quarterback's going to have those rough spots against Alabama. My other concern was just flat-out youth. It's all over the place. Elliott's a sophomore. The offensive line's fairly young. Most of the playmakers on offense, other than Devin Smith, seem to be freshmen and sophomores. Defensively, the defensive backfield, aside from Grant, even the best playmaker on defense, the heralded Joey Bosa, just a sophomore. So such a young team, and that seems to be a narrative all of a sudden this week nationally that, wow, this team's ahead of schedule, but we've been talking about that for quite some time. So just your thought about how this team's emerged so quickly with all this youth.
Well, I think it speaks to the level of recruiting that Meyer and the rest of this coaching staff has done. Ohio State has had, I believe, 3 consecutive top 5 classes. This one might be a little bit of a down class, but it's still going to be in the top 10. And while recruiting stars and rankings might not necessarily be gospel for individual players, if you're filling a team completely full of 4 stars, chances are somebody in that depth chart in each position group is going to pan out. So it really speaks to how well this team has brought talent into the program and how well it's developed it. Ed Warner, Ohio State's offensive line coach, and somebody that we think is probably going to be in line for a promotion now that Tom Herman is gone, has done an absolutely excellent job of coaching up an offensive line that we had to replace 4 starters and isn't, and maybe the only part of the unit on the field that's not chock full of 5-star guys. It looked really terrible against Virginia Tech, struggled at the beginning of the season. Now it's an unquestioned strength of this offense that's led to such a dynamic rushing attack. When you have assistant coaches that are able to coach guys up and you're bringing in guys that have big-time athletic talent, you're going to find yourself in an okay spot.
You know, Matt, everybody knows about Joey Bosa. He's got all the accolades along that defensive front. I believe Alabama was paying quite a bit of attention to Mr. Bosa and allowed some other guys to step up. Michael Bennett's going to be an NFL player maybe for quite some time. He's a force. We saw what Steve Miller did in regards to a big play in dropping into coverage from the other defensive end position. Adolphus Washington was a top recruit. Can you get us familiar maybe with the line and throughout the rest of the Ohio State defense, a linebacking core that's been under scrutiny for quite some time over the last couple of years, and a secondary as well that's much better than it was, let's say, 8 to 10 weeks ago?
Yeah, overall, this is, I think, an underrated defensive unit. Perhaps the one weakness throughout the season, and one that's going to be very magnified coming into this game, is despite this gigantic glut of talent along the defensive line, where I think ultimately Ohio State's going to have at least 3 guys picked within the top 3 rounds of the NFL draft when they eventually leave. It's been a relatively average unit against the run. The Big Ten is obviously chock full of really good running backs, but everybody except for Melvin Gordon was able to have a pretty high degree of success. Langford was able to run in Ohio State. Cobb was able to run in Ohio State. Indiana was able to run in Ohio State, and that's obviously what Oregon's going to want to do. Part of that is because Ohio State occasionally over-pursues in the backfield. And maybe outside of Darren Lee, who's been this really fantastic story, this 3-star guy was a high school quarterback in New Albany, was somebody that a lot of people think was never going to be able to get on the field for Ohio State. Then he becomes the defensive MVP of the Sugar Bowl and is probably Ohio State's best tackler in space and their best playmaker, I think, outside of the defensive line. So the Josh Perry and Curtis Grant, a former 5-star recruit that's finally kind of lived up to his billing a little bit in his senior season. That's an improving linebacking core, but maybe not necessarily the strength of Ohio State's defense and probably where Oregon's going to want to attack. That's the defensive backfield with Von Bell and Connolly and Grant is extremely athletic. Outside of Grant, it's really young. But has improved immeasurably from last season's really kind of dumpster fire of a secondary in terms of preventing big plays, which is so important when you're facing Oregon, when they're going to try to turn those 6-7 yard passes and screens into 23 or 24-yard gains if you're not careful. And that's something that, in part because of the new defensive coordinator, Chris Ash, the Buckeyes have really improved significantly.
Matt, you alluded to the metrics briefly. When you run the in-depth statistics that you guys like to run, is there anything that jumps out as a big advantage for either side?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I think is that Oregon is secretly not that great at run defense, and especially at preventing explosive run plays, which is unfortunate because that's really the bread and butter of Ohio State's offense. You talk about Urban Meyer and his spread, and you had all these running quarterbacks, but fundamentally Ohio State's still a power running football team. They still want to be able to give the ball to Ezekiel Elliott up the middle, and he's been rushed for 200 yards in back-to-back games against 2 very good front sevens. And now Oregon is a team that they're extremely good at forcing turnovers. They're really good at bending and not breaking, but they've struggled with teams that are really physical in running the football. And that's a place where Ohio State's going to really want to attack and put Cardale Jones in positions to succeed. And that's a place where I think Ohio State projects to have a big advantage.
It's funny because in the social media that I take part in, Oregon always seems to get some type of just a lift, or the perception is that they're just a little bit better than they typically are. Now, obviously, right now they're either 1 or 2 in the country, and they have earned that. Looking at the Vegas line, and again, just looking at polls that are taken, not just this season, but every season, it seems like we get to that point in the season, and who are the best teams in the country, and Oregon's always right up there because of the flash and the dash, and there's some things in place that people love to see and are intrigued to see maybe an Oregon play an SEC champion at some point, and they did against Auburn, of course. The thing that I go back to, Matt, is that if you take like the last 5 years span, this Oregon program is elite. There's no question about it. There's the 3 out of 4 years against Stanford. There's the Ohio State Rose Bowl game in 2010. There's the LSU opener. There's the Auburn national championship game against a defense that was pretty marginal for an SEC defense. Yeah. And the narrative seems to be, for me, that this has typically been a program that just outflashes people on the edge, and then when they face a defense that has NFL talent, 6, 7, 8 guys that can match them athletically on the edge, but they can just pound them offensively and defensively up front, that's when Oregon kind of cowers. Do you think this is a different Oregon team this time?
I unquestionably think it's a different Oregon team this time. I'm familiar with that narrative, and from watching a bunch of Oregon games this year, if you watch the Pac-12 championship, when they're playing against an Arizona team that has just as much speed, I think, as Oregon does, and was able to beat them the first time, I don't see how you can watch that and not call it physical. They dominated that line of scrimmage. They were all over the backfield, and they attacked Arizona every position on the field. If you look at the way that Royce Freeman runs, like, that's not some tiny finesse guy. That's somebody who can drag tacklers. That's physical. Oregon's defensive line is very physical. Even Mariota is somebody who can drag people. He's obviously his decision making is excellent, and his precision and his throws is perhaps unmatched in college football. But he's not, he can be physical too. And whether can Ohio State match that physicality, I think so. But I don't think this is the case where it was kind of set up almost as some kind of like Oregon is unable to stop somebody running a power I, or they're insufficiently strong. I definitely don't think that's the case. This is a program that's well coached. It has a great strength and conditioning program. They have guys that are big, and if Ohio State wins, it's not going to be because of the traditional narrative that they hit them with their Stanford problem or something.
All right, Matt, let's finish up with the head coaches here. We've got Urban Meyer, who most of College Football Nation before the Alabama game would have said, just based on accolades, is the second best coach in the country. Now, I always kind of like to shy away from just adding up national championships and winning percentages and say that guy's the best and he's the second best, but that was kind of the narrative that Saban's the king of the hill. Now there's talk that Urban Meyer has equaled or surpassed based on the head-to-head situation. Aside from all the numbers and so forth, what makes this guy so good to prepare a third-string quarterback? And again, that's the headline, but there's so much more to it in regards to Urban Meyer and what he brings to the table and what he's done with his program.
I honestly think the number one thing that Urban Meyer is able to do is that he has an outstanding record of hiring assistants. The Urban Meyer coaching tree right now throughout college football is very large, and it's been really successful. We see what Dan Mullen's been able to do. We see what there's guys who has accolades that are in the Big Ten, that they're all over the country, and now Tom Herman is going to get a chance here to go here with Houston. I don't think that there's a guy on this staff right now that isn't a dynamic recruiter for his position group, that doesn't have a record of being able to coach up talent, and that isn't extremely competitive. And there's probably on the Ohio State staff right now, there's probably at least 2 or 3 other people that I think are going to be Division I head coaches within 2 or 3 years. Luke Fickell has gotten interviews. Drayton has gotten interviews. Chris Ash interviewed for the Colorado State job this year. And when you're able to hire 6 people and train them and manage them and run a program who are prospective FBS head coaches, you're going to do really well. There's a lot of coaches in college football that are really dynamic X's and O minds. There are people who are dynamic individual recruiters. There are people who have strong clock management. There's very few people that are above average at most of those categories, and I think Meyer is in that elite group. So when you factor that in with being extremely competitive and that crazy work ethic, and Ohio State's resources as a program, you're going to do pretty well.
Yeah, there's a video on YouTube with Urban Meyer addressing the Ohio High School Athletic Coaches Association that's impressive, just emphasizing to them how important it is for coaches to be teachers and really talking to them about being teachers. And if the kid doesn't understand it, if he doesn't get it, if he cannot regurgitate that information or that process or that technique back to you, you're not a very good teacher, you're not very effective. Yeah. And it's an extremely interesting teaching tool down to the finest detail of what needs to be taught to be a fine football player. So interesting stuff there. When I think of Mark Helfrich, got to admit, haven't done a ton of research on the guy's background or not become extremely familiar other than seeing him stand on the sidelines when I watch the big games that the Ducks are involved in, because it's just, the groupthink national perspective is more like Mike Bellotti established the program, was pretty innovative offensively, and then Chip Kelly amplified that about 10,000 times, and now Helfrich is just kind of stepping in and just standing on the sideline and rolling out the ball on the field. But it's much more than that.
Yeah, I think that maybe Helfrich wasn't getting enough credit for his role in the game planning and the innovation and the execution of what Chip Kelly was doing at Oregon, which is in terms of running those practices and getting the enormous amounts of reps for everybody all over the field. That's relatively unique in college football, and that's great for building depth when you want to run the tempo that Oregon does when you're experiencing injuries, because that guy who's a redshirt freshman who might be getting 50 practice reps at Penn State, at Oregon's going to get 120. And that's going to really help your ability to be able to plug in guys, which Oregon was able to do on the offensive line and a wide receiver this year. Helfrich and his staff right now, I think, is actually also been recruiting at a higher level than Kelly. And that's something that is really important for Oregon, since this is a school that's not in a location that has a bunch of organic, blue chip talent just down the street. They have to go to Texas, they have to go to California. Oregon has a couple of Ohio kids on this roster, and to be able to have a head coach who's maybe a little bit less prickly and a staff that's more dialed into that, while still able to execute Kelly's vision and the things that make Oregon as a football program unique, that helps, I think, elevate the ceiling of what Oregon football is capable of doing.
Matt Brown of SB Nation. Matt, I came across a prediction on land grant. I don't know how much you were involved, so if you're not ready to pull the trigger, that's fine. But if you've got a pick for us, we'd love to hear it.
I really think Ohio State's going to win this game. It's going to be extremely exciting to watch. I think both teams are going to be able to score in the 40s. We're watching some of the most exciting and dynamic offensive players here in college football. I like Ohio State's ability to not turn over the football enough to let Oregon have an advantage and win something in the neighborhood of like 45-41.
All right, Matt Brown of SB Nation. Love the insight and the information, Matt. It's great stuff. Maybe sometime we can talk some Harbaugh and talk some Big Ten perception that might have been corrected to a certain extent this past bowl season. Appreciate the time.
You bet.